His ex-girlfriend watched him dig for 2 years instead of 2 months. When he has a shovel in his hand, she said, he's like a coke addict with piles of coke. His wife called it a Peter Pan complex. Engineers said the caves would collapse. No blueprints, no surveys, no structural calculations. For 25 years, the art world responded with silence. Then a realtor listed 208 acres of New Mexico desert for $995,000. The value came from 2 underground chambers carved entirely by hand. The Academy nominated a documentary about his work for an Oscar. Critics compared him to Gaudí. The man who charged $12 an hour had created masterpieces now worth millions. The real estate listing read like a fever dream. 208 acres of New Mexico desert, priced at $995,000. The value did not come from the scrubland or the views of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. It came from 2 structures that could not be seen from the surface, underground sanctuaries carved entirely by hand into the sandstone cliffs. The listing described them as unforgettable hand-carved underground sandstone cathedrals. The smaller chamber featured smooth walls, buffed to an alabaster finish, streams of natural light pouring through windows carved directly into the mountainside. The larger held an intricate sculpture called the Tree of Human Kindness, candle-lit niches, recessed seating carved from solid rock, side rooms washed in sunlight from skylights punched through 30 feet of stone above. A realtor named Tom Abrams told CBS News the obvious: "We're selling 2 of Paulette's caves, along with the 200 or so acres around them, for close to $1 million." The man who created these spaces had charged $12 an hour. He had no engineering degree, no architecture license, no formal training in sculpting, construction, or any discipline that might explain how a single person could carve cathedral-scale chambers out of solid rock, using nothing but a pickaxe and a wheelbarrow. In 2014, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences nominated a documentary about his work for an Oscar. Film critics called his caves the 8th wonder of the world. They compared him to Gaudí, to the great land artists whose work hung in museums and commanded millions. But 25 years earlier, when Paulette first picked up a shovel and announced he was going to carve cathedrals out of the New Mexico desert, no one was comparing him to Gaudí. They were questioning his sanity. Paulette was not the kind of man anyone expected to create world-class art. He was born in La Porte, Indiana, the oldest of 4 children in a family that would not produce artists or architects or anyone who carved caves for a living. He dropped out of college. He served 4 years on a Navy flagship during Vietnam, not as an officer, not as anyone important, just another young man filling time until discharge. After the Navy, he drifted. He hitchhiked across America, working whatever jobs would have him: postal employee, security guard, janitor, farm laborer. His employers on the farms gave him a nickname: the human backhoe. He could outwork machines through sheer stubborn persistence, moving earth all day without complaint. In 1977, Paulette visited an old friend in Arroyo Seco, New Mexico. Something about the high desert landscape held him. By 1984, he had settled in Embudo, a small town between Santa Fe and Taos, near Carson National Forest. He worked as a landscaper. He counseled developmentally disabled adults. He pursued what he called inner peace, though to outside observers, his life looked more like outer aimlessness. He was 40 years old. He had no career, no credentials, no clear purpose. No money to speak of, and no indication that the next 3 decades would transform him into something the art world had never seen. The change began with a job digging outhouses. In 1985, Paulette took work in Dixon as an excavator, basic manual labor, building wells, digging pits, moving earth. The kind of work that required a strong back and no questions asked. But something about the rhythm of it awakened him. The meditative quality of breaking ground, the satisfaction of shaping negative space. The way hours disappeared when his body fell into the pattern of dig, lift, dump, return. Then he noticed something that would alter the course of his life. Local teenagers had clawed a small cave out of the Ojo Caliente sandstone. It was crude work, just a hole in a hillside, barely deep enough to sit in. But it proved something crucial. This sandstone was soft enough to carve by hand. and it was firm enough to hold its shape. Paulette studied the teenager's cave. He ran his hands along the walls. He felt the consistency of the stone, what he would later describe as a solidness that is all one thing. Unlike other rock formations that crumbled unpredictably along seams and faults, this sandstone was homogeneous, uniform, forgiving. The revelation arrived with the force of religious conversion. He could do this. He could do this better. Not a hole, a sanctuary, a cathedral carved into the living rock. His method would be simple. Dig down first, then across, then breach upward to draw natural sunlight into the chamber. Let the shapes emerge through feel rather than blueprint. Break every movement into its simplest parts, the dance of digging, and reassemble them into efficient patterns. Work alone without interference until the vision completed itself. He had no training in architecture, no understanding of structural engineering, no knowledge of how to calculate load distribution or predict where sandstone might fail. He had only his body, his tools, and an absolute certainty that the caves were already there, waiting inside the stone for someone patient enough to uncover them. In 1987, Paulette carved his first cave. He called it the Heart Chamber. He created it on Bureau of Land Management property in the Rio Grande Gorge. He did not ask permission. He simply began, walking into the desert each morning with his tools, carving deeper into the hillside each day, shaping walls and ceilings and alcoves by feel alone. The cave was intended as a personal retreat, a private sanctuary where he could sit in darkness surrounded by stone he had shaped with his own hands. But word spread. Hikers discovered the Heart Chamber, then more hikers. The cave became an informal shrine. Visitors left offerings, crosses, Hindu icons, Native American fetishes, Buddhist statues, all crowded together in the darkness, a spontaneous temple to something no one could quite name. It was amazing, Paulette recalled years later. There were all different kinds of religious expressions, all side by side. Then came hundreds of people, and with them, fear. Paulette understood something that most artists never have to consider. His medium could kill. A miscalculation in the stone, an aggressive cut in the wrong place, and the ceiling could come down on visitors who had no idea they were standing inside a structural question mark. Most painters don't have to worry that the painting is going to fall off the wall and crush the patron, he said. He confessed to the Bureau of Land Management. He told them what he had done, carved an illegal cave on federal property that was now attracting crowds. The BLM response was bureaucratic and final. Fill it back in. They provided a small stipend for the labor. Paulette spent weeks undoing his own work, wheelbarrow load by wheelbarrow load, watching the Heart Chamber disappear back into the mountain. But he had learned what he was capable of, and he had learned something else, something that would sustain him through decades of doubt and dismissal. People wanted these spaces. They responded to them on a level that defied explanation. The cave effect was real. Paulette could have returned to landscaping after the Heart Chamber. He could have gone back to counseling, to odd jobs, to the drifter's life that had carried him across America. No one would have blamed him. No one would have noticed. Instead, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would keep digging, not for money. He would charge $12 an hour, barely enough to survive, far less than any contractor, a wage that announced to the world he was not serious about commerce. Not for recognition, he would work in remote locations, often on private property, his creations known only to a handful of locals who happened to stumble across them. He would dig for the work itself, for the process, for the discovery of spaces that seemed to already exist within the stone, waiting to be uncovered. His wife would support them financially, working as an advocate for hospice patients, while he charged $12 an hour to dig holes in the desert. His marriage would strain under the weight of his obsession. The neighbors would shake their heads at the eccentric who walked into the wilderness each morning with a wheelbarrow strapped to his back. But Ra Paulette had found his purpose. The only question was whether anyone else would ever understand it. No structural engineer would have approved what Paulette was doing. His method violated every principle of safe underground construction. No geological surveys before carving, no blueprints or structural calculations, no reinforcement materials, no safety backup, no formal training in any relevant discipline. Just a man with a pickaxe working alone in remote desert locations, carving chambers by feel into stone that engineers classified as inherently unstable. The technical objection was straightforward, the kind any licensed professional would make. You cannot dig habitable spaces into rock formation without proper engineering. Sandstone contains seams, faults, variations in density invisible to the eye. A miscalculation in load distribution, carving too aggressively here, removing too much support there, and the ceiling comes down. This is basic physics. This is why building codes exist. This is why people with credentials spend years learning to calculate what amateurs cannot see. Paulette had no response to this objection except to keep digging. The skepticism extended beyond anonymous engineers. It came from the people closest to the work, the patrons who commissioned caves on their own property. Shel Neymark and Liz Riedel knew Paulette well. Liz was his ex-girlfriend. They had remained friends, close enough that when the couple wanted a cave carved on their land, they hired Paulette without hesitation. They understood his temperament. They knew what they were getting into, or they thought they did. The project was supposed to take 2 months and cost $2,000. Privately, Shel and Liz doubled that estimate. 4 months, $4,000 seemed more realistic given Paulette's tendencies. 2 years later, the project was still ongoing. During those 2 years, Liz received a diagnosis that changed everything: advanced melanoma, breast cancer. Doctors gave her a 20% chance of surviving 5 years. The couple asked Paulette to stop. They needed to focus on treatment, on survival, on the terrifying uncertainty of a body turning against itself. They asked him multiple times. They believed at least once or twice that they had convinced him. He refused to leave the project. When he has a shovel in his hand, Liz observed, he's like a coke addict with piles of coke. The accusation carried the weight of someone who had loved him, who understood his gifts, and who could no longer pretend those gifts came without cost. Here was a man creating something unprecedented, something beautiful, and he could not stop even when the people who had invited him into their lives begged him to. Other patrons told similar stories. They arrived at work sites with opinions about what their caves should look like, and Paulette found their input absurd. They demanded timelines he could not meet, budgets he could not honor, compromises he could not accept. The conflicts followed a predictable pattern: enthusiasm at the beginning, frustration at the delays, then either grudging acceptance of Paulette's vision or bitter termination of the project. Few caves reached completion. Most stalled when Paulette's artistic obsession collided with the property owner's patience. Jeffrey Karoff, the filmmaker who would eventually document Paulette's work, observed the dynamic with bemused clarity. Here's a guy who's doing something that has never been done before, and yet his patrons all have opinions about what their caves should be. Where did those opinions come from? What are you comparing this to? The question cut both ways. What were the patrons comparing their caves to, but also what was Paulette comparing his life to? What model of artistic practice allowed for 2-year delays, broken promises, and absolute indifference to the needs of the people paying him? The skepticism came home too. Paulette's wife supported the household financially, while her husband charged $12 an hour, when he charged anything at all. Many of his caves were created on pure speculation, with no patron, no income, and no certainty that anyone would ever see the finished work. The documentary Cave Digger captured her perspective in a phrase that landed like a verdict. Paulette had a Peter Pan complex. His obsession prevented him from pursuing what most adults pursue: recognition, remuneration, advancement, security. The reasonable demands of partnership, the normal expectations of a shared life. Her demands of security are so reasonable, Paulette himself acknowledged. But they're not demands I share. He said it without defensiveness, almost without awareness that he was admitting something damning. Everyone else grew up, and he didn't. His wife worked to pay the bills while he dug holes in the desert for $12 an hour. Perhaps the cruelest skepticism came from no one in particular, from the simple, crushing silence of the art world. For 25 years, Paulette created work that critics would eventually compare to Gaudí and the great land artists: Goldsworthy, Smithson, de Maria. Names that appeared in museum catalogues and university syllabi, artists whose work commanded millions and shaped entire movements. Paulette knew those names. He had watched Rivers and Tides, the documentary that made Andy Goldsworthy famous. He understood where his work fit in the tradition of land art, or where it would fit if anyone ever noticed. But no one noticed. No galleries, no collectors, no grants, no institutional support, no critical reviews, no museum exhibitions, no academic attention. For a quarter century, Ra Paulette carved caves in the New Mexico desert, and the art world responded with absolute indifference. The silence carried its own message. If this work mattered, someone would have said so. If these caves belonged alongside Goldsworthy's sculptures or Smithson's spiral jetty, someone with credentials would have made the case. The absence of recognition was itself a judgment. This was not art. This was one man's peculiar hobby, hidden in the wilderness, signifying nothing. Paulette felt the weight of that silence. The filmmaker noticed envy when Goldsworthy's name came up, though Paulette would not admit it on camera. 25 years, 14 caves, thousands upon thousands of hours of solitary labor. And the world's response was a shrug. The skeptics had not been proven wrong. They had not been proven anything. They had simply stopped paying attention, which in its own way was the most devastating verdict of all. Every morning for 25 years, Ra Paulette performed the same ritual. He strapped a wheelbarrow onto a sled-like device. He hoisted the awkward assemblage onto his back, 50 pounds of steel and wood balanced across his shoulders. Then he moved across the rock-strewn landscape toward his current project, picking his way through scrub brush and arroyos with what one filmmaker would later describe as a dancer's grace. His only companion was Bugsy, the cave dog. The dog followed him into the desert each morning and waited outside the cave entrance while Paulette worked, hour after hour in the darkness of the mountain. The work sites were remote. Some required hiking over a mile into the wilderness, uphill at elevation, in the thin air of the high desert. The New Mexico sun was relentless. Water had to be carried in, tools had to be hauled, and at the end of each day the debris had to be hauled out. At the face of the sandstone, the rhythm began. Working with mattocks, shovels and scrapers, Paulette attacked the cliff. One rock gave way, then a spray of gravel. He worked the material loose, breaking it into pieces small enough to shovel, loading the debris into the wheelbarrow, hauling it outside to the growing tailings pile. Then he returned and started again. The physical demands would have broken most men his age. 8 hours of labor, day after day, year after year, breaking stone, shoveling rubble, pushing wheelbarrow loads uphill and across uneven terrain. His body was his primary tool, and he treated it accordingly, maintaining what he called bodily ease through efficient movement patterns, the dance of digging. "When I'm doing this dance of labor, I'm totally engrossed in it," Paulette explained. "I'm feeling my body. I give myself over to it. It's a type of surrender, a lack of thinking about it, just going into the process." The technical challenge of cave making defied simple explanation. Each cave began with an impossible problem, finding the floor inside a mountain. Paulette's approach was counterintuitive. Rather than digging straight in, he varied elevation constantly, up and down, feeling for the natural architecture hidden within the stone. He positioned floor levels higher than entrance points for a practical reason. It meant never having to wheelbarrow debris uphill. He worked without blueprints. The shapes emerged through intuition, through a constant dialogue between his intentions and the stone's resistance. He called it intuitive engineering, a phrase that would make any licensed structural engineer wince. "I don't have plans," he explained. "I seem to be uncovering something that already exists. It's there in front of me, and I'm just working hard to see what's there." The skylights were his signature. He broke through ceilings deliberately, punching holes 30 feet up through solid rock to draw natural light into chambers that would otherwise remain in permanent darkness. These apertures served practical purposes. He could see his work without artificial light, but they also created the psychological effect that Paulette believed made his caves transcendent. "The sense of being underground with the light streaming in," he said. "Those are the juxtapositions of the two metaphors of our life, the inside, the within, the darkness, and then the light of the open sky." He was trying to create spaces that would transform anyone who entered them. Not through argument or explanation, but through direct experience, the cave effect. Once the basic excavation established a chamber, the artistry intensified. Paulette carved arches that swept upward 30 to 40 feet. He sculpted columns that appeared to grow organically from floor to ceiling, as if the stone had always wanted to take these shapes. He created bas-relief decorations, flowers, abstract suns, flowing patterns that seemed to emerge naturally from the cave walls themselves. The walls were buffed to an alabaster finish, smooth as polished marble. Benches materialized from solid rock. Niches appeared for candles. Doorways connected chambers in sequences designed to unfold like a journey inward, each room revealing something the previous room had concealed. The scale defied comprehension. Single chambers approached the dimensions of small houses, every surface bearing the evidence of handwork, the texture of tools, the rhythm of human effort inscribed in stone. No one had ever seen anything like it, and almost no one was seeing it. The caves existed in near total obscurity, known only to the handful of patrons who had commissioned them and the occasional hiker who stumbled across one by accident. The work continued regardless, but the setbacks accumulated. The Neymark project, intended as 2 months, stretched to 2 years, became the defining example of Paulette's inability to work within human timelines. Liz's cancer diagnosis, her treatment, her survival against 20% odds, all of it unfolded while Paulette kept carving, unable or unwilling to stop. Other patrons terminated projects mid-construction, fed up with delays and cost overruns. The caves they had commissioned sat unfinished, monuments to the collision between artistic obsession and practical reality. And then came the accident. Paulette had been working on a major project, pouring 2 years of labor into a cave that was shaping up to be one of his most ambitious. But the stone was wrong. "That wasn't the usual Ojo Caliente sandstone," he recalled later. "It was in my backyard. I did my best, but the material didn't work." The heterogeneous rock seemed faulted, inconsistent, behaved unpredictably. Something gave way. 2 years of work ended in a single moment of structural failure. The skeptics had predicted this. The engineers who said sandstone was unstable, the observers who called his method reckless, the doubters who assumed he would eventually be buried under his own creation, they had all imagined this moment, the inevitable consequence of working without blueprints in a medium that killed people when it failed. Paulette walked away from the collapse physically unharmed. He had not been inside when the stone gave way, but the psychological impact should have been devastating. 2 years of daily labor, erased. The critics vindicated. His method, intuitive engineering, conservative shapes, feeling his way through the stone, proven fallible. Jeffrey Karoff, the filmmaker, called Paulette 7 days after the project ended. He expected to find a broken man. He had documented enough of Paulette's obsession to understand what the loss would mean. Instead, Paulette said, "Yeah, well, it was pretty shocking, but on the other hand, I'm really excited about this project that I've got going now." 7 days. He had already moved on. He was already planning his next cave, what he called his magnum opus. A private project with no patron, no interference, no one to answer to. A cave that would take 10 years to complete. Karoff understood then what made Paulette different from anyone he had ever encountered. "Who does that?" he asked, "except somebody for whom the process is even more important than the product?" The answer was obvious. No one did that. Normal people did not recover from 2 years of lost work in 7 days. Normal people did not respond to structural failure by starting an even more ambitious project. Normal people did not charge $12 an hour while their wives paid the bills, did not ignore patron deadlines while pursuing private visions, did not carve caves alone in the desert for a quarter century while the art world pretended they didn't exist. Paulette was not normal. He never had been. And by 2010, when Karoff finally began filming the documentary in earnest, the question was no longer whether Paulette was talented or obsessed or delusional. The question was whether anyone would ever see what he had created. 14 caves existed across northern New Mexico. The windows of the Earth Sanctuary, carved over 2.5 years for Rancho de San Juan Country Inn, 20-foot ceilings, mirror-topped pedestals reflecting the sky like subterranean pools. The Neymark residence, the only cave designed as a permanent dwelling, running water, electricity, built-in drums, bed platforms excavated into the walls. The tree of human kindness, with its intricate carvings and candle-lit niches and skylights, drawing desert sun into chambers that had never seen natural light before, Paulette opened them. Each cave represented thousands of hours of labor. Each demonstrated a mastery that no credential could confer. Each waited, hidden in the New Mexico wilderness, for someone to notice. Paulette was 67 years old. His body had absorbed decades of physical punishment, the toll of moving stone by hand, of hiking miles into the desert with equipment on his back, of working alone without safety measures in spaces that could collapse without warning. He had no retirement savings, no residuals, no ongoing income from caves that would eventually be valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars. The properties he had transformed belonged to other people. The wealth he had created would enrich the patrons who had complained about his timelines, not the artist who had given his life to the work. The documentary was filming. Karoff had found his story, the conflict between creative freedom and financial reality, the artist versus the patron, the outsider whose work might belong alongside Goldsworthy and Smithson, if only someone would look. But would anyone watch a 38-minute film about a 67-year-old man digging caves with a pickaxe? Would the art world finally pay attention after 25 years of silence? Would the skeptics, the engineers, the patrons, the wife who had supported him while he earned $12 an hour, the establishment that had ignored him completely, would any of them reckon with what Ra Paulette had actually achieved? The cameras were rolling. The caves existed. The proof was carved into the mountains of northern New Mexico, waiting to be seen. But the real test hadn't come yet. The documentary almost didn't happen. Jeffrey Karoff first saw Ra Paulette's work in 2000 at a pancake breakfast fundraiser for the local volunteer fire department. He and his wife had recently bought a vacation house in the small New Mexico town where Paulette worked. They sat down next to strangers, made small talk, and heard something that sounded like a joke. They said they were having a cave made on their property, Karoff recalled. The strangers were Shel Neymark and Liz Riedel. The cave was already years behind schedule. Liz had been diagnosed with cancer during the construction. They were, in Karoff's word, exasperated, but they invited the newcomers to see it anyway. Karoff expected a hole in the ground. What he found stopped him cold. Where they might have expected a jagged hole in the northern New Mexico dirt, they instead marveled at soaring walls buffed to an alabaster finish, bas-relief sculptures that carried them between the arches separating rooms, skylights luring sunshine onto long-buried earth. He walked into the Neymark cave and felt something shift. "My reaction was visceral," he said. "I was pretty stunned by what he was producing." Karoff was a Los Angeles-based producer of commercials. He had spent his career creating polished content for corporate clients, work that paid well and vanished from memory the moment it aired. He had attended film school at UCLA, trained at the American Film Institute's director program, founded a director-actor workshop. He knew how to tell stories, and he knew, standing in that cave, that he had found one. But the story refused to cooperate. Karoff began filming, initially just a spec spot for Canon cameras, something to showcase what the new equipment could do. The footage was beautiful. The caves were undeniably striking, but the narrative eluded him. "I wasn't particularly interested in making a piece that was simply exploring an artist and his process and work," Karoff explained. "I wanted to find something deeper and more universal." For 10 years he searched for that deeper thing. The technology changed. Digital cameras became capable of capturing the cave's intricate details. Editing software made independent production feasible. But the story still needed a shape. Karoff kept returning to New Mexico. He filmed Paulette working. He interviewed the patrons, some satisfied, many frustrated. He documented the conflicts that seemed to define every commission, the artist's vision colliding with the owner's timeline, the contractor's obligations warring with the creator's obsession. Then came the accident. 2 years of work, destroyed. A cave that had been taking shape, reduced to rubble. The skeptics vindicated, the method proven fallible, the artist facing the kind of setback that breaks careers and spirits. Karoff called Paulette 7 days later. "Yeah, well, it was pretty shocking," Paulette said. "But on the other hand, I'm really excited about this project that I've got going now." The filmmaker understood. He had found his story. "Who does that?" Karoff asked, "except somebody for whom the process is even more important than the product." The documentary had found its structure. Not a portrait of an artist, but a study in obsession. Not a celebration of the caves, but an examination of what they cost, the patrons, the wife, the artist himself. The timeless conflict between creative freedom and financial reality, between vision and compromise, between the world's reasonable demands and one man's unreasonable refusal to meet them. Karov shot for 2.5 more years. He captured Paulette breaking ground on his magnum opus, the private project with no patron, no interference, no one to answer to. A cave that would take 10 years to complete. The film ended there, with Paulette raising his pickaxe against fresh stone, starting over at 67 years old with nothing but his body and his tools and his certainty that the caves were waiting inside the mountain. Cave Digger premiered in 2013. 38 minutes. No theatrical distribution, no marketing budget. Just a short documentary about an obscure artist that most people would never hear about. Then the awards started coming. Best Documentary Short at the San Antonio Film Festival. Best Short at the Newburyport Documentary Film Festival. Best Short Audience Award at the Maui Film Festival. Best Non-European Documentary at the European Independent Film Festival. The film played in Barcelona, in Bellingham, in cities across the world where documentary enthusiasts gathered to watch stories that mainstream audiences would never see. Critics who specialized in independent film began writing reviews. Be it madness or genius, selfish or glorious, this is an extraordinary story. Well told, wrote Tom Long in the Detroit News. My favorite of the bunch. An absolutely gorgeous bloom, wrote Colin Covert in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. A dazzler. The reviews accumulated, the screenings multiplied, and then in January 2014 came the announcement that changed everything. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences released its nominations for the 86th Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor. The categories that made headlines, that launched careers, that transformed obscure filmmakers into household names. And in the category of Best Documentary Short Film, Cave Digger. For 25 years, Ra Paulette had carved caves in near-total obscurity. The art world had ignored him. The establishment had dismissed him. His own patrons had complained about his timelines and his obsession and his inability to function like a normal contractor. Now the same organization that awarded Oscars to Spielberg and Scorsese had taken notice of a 67-year-old man digging holes in the desert with a pickaxe. The nomination arrived like a verdict on everything the skeptics had said. The engineers who predicted collapse, Paulette's caves had stood for decades. The windows of the Earth Sanctuary, carved in the 1990s, still hosted visitors. The Neymark residence had been continuously inhabited for over 15 years, its hand-carved walls showing no signs of structural distress. The patrons who complained about timelines? Their caves were now worth more than they had ever imagined. The frustration they had felt during construction, the delays, the cost overruns, the arguments about artistic vision had produced something that could not be replicated, could not be valued by conventional standards, could not be created by any contractor working on any timeline. The wife who had called him a Peter Pan? The man who refused to grow up had been recognized by the highest authority in American filmmaking. The obsession that had strained their marriage, that had forced her to support them while he earned $12 an hour, it had produced work that the Academy considered worthy of its attention. The art world that had ignored him for a quarter century, critics were now comparing him to Gaudí, to Goldsworthy, Smithson, de Maria, the names that appeared in museum catalogues and university syllabi, the artists whose work shaped entire movements. Paulette's spectacular, Gaudí-like caves are easily on par with the most well-known land artists, Karoff wrote. Yet only a small circle in northern New Mexico was aware of his work. The emphasis mattered, was aware. Past tense. That was about to change. The nomination brought attention. The attention brought journalists. CBS News sent a crew to New Mexico to interview the cave digger, to walk through his creations, to ask the obvious questions that no one had bothered asking for 25 years. And with the journalists came the appraisers. For the first time, people began calculating what Paulette's caves were actually worth. Not as art. Art valuation remained subjective, contested, impossible to pin down, but as real estate, as property, as structures that added measurable value to the land they occupied. The answer was staggering. the 208-acre property containing the Tree of Human Kindness, and one other cave listed for $995,000. Nearly $1 million for desert scrubland, whose primary value derived from holes dug by a man earning $12 an hour. A real estate listing described the caves in language that would have seemed lunatic a decade earlier. Two unforgettable hand-carved underground sandstone cathedrals or meditation chambers carved by renowned cave artist Ra Paulette. Renowned. The word appeared in official property listings. The eccentric drifter had become a renowned artist, his work adding hundreds of thousands of dollars to the value of land he did not own. Tom Abrams, the realtor handling the sale, told CBS News the obvious. "We're selling two of Paulette's caves, along with the 200 or so acres around them, for close to $1 million. But Paulette would not see any of that money. The caves belonged to the landowners. The patrons who had commissioned them complained about them, argued over timelines and budgets and artistic control. The value Paulette had created would enrich the people who had hired him, not the artist who had given decades of his life to the work." The man who carved million-dollar caves had charged $12 an hour. He had no retirement savings, no residuals, no ongoing income from his creations. His wife still supported the household. The economics of his life had not changed. A reporter asked him the question that hovered over everything. "Do you ever get lonely up here doing all this work?" Paulette's answer revealed something the reporter had not expected. "You know, I'm never lonely." He was already at work on his magnum opus. The Oscar nomination, the property valuations, the sudden attention from journalists and critics, none of it had altered his trajectory. He had been digging caves alone in the desert for 25 years. He would continue until he could not. The vindication had arrived. But Ra Paulette seemed barely to notice. The skeptics had to reckon with results they had not predicted. Shel Neymark and Liz Riedel, the couple who had commissioned a 2-month project and received a 2-year odyssey, still lived in their cave. The frustration that had consumed them during construction had transformed into something difficult to name. 18 years after Liz's cancer diagnosis, after doctors had given her a 20% chance of surviving 5 years, she remained alive. She woke each morning in a bedroom carved from solid rock, surrounded by walls that Ra Paulette had shaped by hand while she underwent treatment, while she asked him to stop, while she compared him to a coke addict who could not put down his shovel. Shel's assessment had shifted completely. "Ra is like no other person I've ever known," he said. "He totally gives himself up for other people. He is less interested in financial rewards or the trappings of society than anybody else. He is happy with almost no possessions. Those things just don't interest him." The words carried the weight of someone who had watched his initial frustration dissolve into understanding. They lived inside a work of art. The cave could not be commissioned today at any price. Paulette no longer took commissions. It could not be replicated by any other artist. No one else possessed his combination of skill, patience, and willingness to work for $12 an hour. It could not be valued by any conventional standard. What had felt like an ordeal during construction now felt like a gift. Liz was alive. The cave endured. Ra Paulette was still digging. The patrons who had terminated projects faced a different reckoning. The caves they had abandoned, unfinished, compromised, stopped mid-creation when budgets ran out or patience snapped, represented lost possibilities. They had hired an artist whose work now commanded nearly $1 million in real estate value, and they had fired him over timeline disputes. The filmmaker captured some of their interviews. Karoff described them as semi-satisfied clients, their responses eliciting rueful chuckles. They had gotten caves, but not the caves Paulette had envisioned. They had saved money but lost something that money could not recover. The engineering skeptics faced evidence they could not dismiss. Paulette's caves had not collapsed. The homogeneous Ojo Caliente sandstone had behaved exactly as he predicted, holding its shape when carved conservatively, supporting loads that intuition rather than calculation had determined. His intuitive engineering had produced structures that functioned as intended year after year, without the geological surveys or structural blueprints that professional standards demanded. "The Ojo Caliente sandstone is homogeneous," Paulette explained to anyone who asked. "You're dealing with one material, basically going into a solidness that is all one thing. If your shapes are conservatively engineered, I don't have problems." He had learned things that could not be taught. The feel of stable stone, the intuition for load distribution, the recognition of danger signs that no textbook could convey. 30 years of trial and error had transformed him into an engineer, just not the kind anyone recognized. The one project failure, the accident that ended 2 years of work, had occurred in different material. That wasn't the usual Ojo Caliente sandstone, he said. The material didn't work. The exception proved the rule. His method worked in the right conditions, and he had learned to identify those conditions through experience rather than credential. The art world's reckoning arrived in the form of critical comparisons that would have seemed absurd before the documentary. Writers situated Paulette within the tradition of land art, the movement that had produced Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, James Turrell's Rodin Crater, Michael Heiser's Double Negative. These were names that appeared in art history textbooks, artists whose work attracted pilgrims and scholars and institutional funding. Paulette had worked in that tradition for 25 years without anyone noticing. The caves were land art. They engaged with the earth at scale. They transformed landscape into experience. They belonged alongside the canonical works of the movement. But the recognition came with an asterisk that Paulette himself seemed to understand. He remained an outsider artist in both senses of the phrase, one who had never gone through the art school system and one whose work could not be displayed in museums or galleries. You could not move a cave to MoMA. You could not auction a sanctuary at Christie's. The work existed only in the New Mexico desert, accessible only to those willing to hike into the wilderness or pay for guided tours. Paulette was aware of the irony. He knew Andy Goldsworthy's acclaim. He had watched Rivers and Tides, the documentary that made Goldsworthy famous. He understood that where Goldsworthy had become a household name, he himself remained, even after the Oscar nomination, largely unknown outside documentary film circles. "I sensed some envy," Karoff observed, "that he would never admit to on camera." The recognition had arrived, but it had arrived late, after 25 years of silence, after Paulette had entered his 70s, after the patterns of his life had become fixed beyond alteration. He would not suddenly start charging market rates for his labor. He would not hire assistants or accept commissions or behave like an artist whose work commanded nearly $1 million in property value. He was who he had always been. The world had simply started paying attention. Not everyone converted. An IMDb reviewer watching the Oscar-nominated documentary called it a very slight film about a very strange man. The caves were mildly interesting, but the subject matter just didn't seem to merit a film this long. About 10 minutes would have probably sufficed. Other visitors to the caves, now commercialized through Origin at Rancho de San Juan, a wellness resort that offered guided tours, complained about the experience. "New Age nonsense," one reviewer wrote, objecting to the meditation sessions and essential oils and spiritual framing that the resort had imposed on Paulette's work. The skepticism had not disappeared. It had simply become a minority position, overwhelmed by evidence but not extinguished by it. Some people would never see what others found self-evident. Some critics would always dismiss what they could not explain. Paulette seemed unbothered by both the praise and the persistent doubt. "I'm in the big time now," he laughed when asked about the Oscar nomination. The statement was clearly ironic. He had no interest in the big time. He never had. A reporter asked the obvious question, "Do you get rich off of creating such wonderful living spaces?" "No," Paulette said. "It's the process, you know." At 67 years old, nominated for an Academy Award, his caves valued at nearly $1 million, Ra Paulette was exactly where he had always been, in the desert, alone with his dog, pickaxe in hand, working on his magnum opus. The vindication had come. The skeptics had been proven wrong or had fallen silent, which amounted to the same thing. The world had finally noticed what he had been creating for a quarter century. And Ra Paulette kept digging. The caves could not be replicated. This was the truth that emerged from the recognition, the uncomfortable fact that distinguished Paulette's work from most artistic achievements. Other artists could be imitated. Their techniques could be studied, taught, transmitted to the next generation. Schools could form around their methods. Movements could spread their influence. Paulette's method could not scale. It could not be systematized. It could not be taught, not because the techniques were secret, but because the prerequisites were impossible to transmit. "I've tried to tell young guys that they can do this," Paulette admitted, "but it doesn't register." The young guys heard the words. They understood intellectually what was involved: the years of solitary labor, the physical demands, the financial sacrifice, the isolation. But understanding was not the same as willingness. No one wanted to spend 10 years carving a single cave. No one wanted to charge $12 an hour for work that commanded hundreds of thousands in property value. No one wanted to hike a mile into the desert each morning with a wheelbarrow strapped to their back. You could not give someone 30 years of patience. You could not manufacture the particular form of stubbornness that kept a person digging caves alone in the desert while the world ignored them. You could not teach indifference to conventional success, the willingness to let others profit from your labor, the acceptance that recognition might never come. The caves were singular. When Ra Paulette stopped digging, no one would continue his work. The existing caves would remain, monuments to one man's impossible persistence, but no new ones would be carved. Perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps the point was never to create a movement, but to demonstrate what one person could accomplish when they refused to accept that something could not be done. The caves endured. Origin at Rancho de San Juan offered guided tours of the windows of the Earth Sanctuary. $50 per person, limited to 16 guests. 90 minutes including the hike up and a sound meditation inside the chamber. Private tours with sacred sound experiences cost over $700 for groups. The tours describe Paulette's work in language that would have seemed hyperbolic before the documentary: land art, sanctuary, masterpiece. Visitors removed their shoes and dug their toes into the silky sand floors. They sat on benches carved from solid rock. They looked up at skylights that drew the desert sun into chambers 30 feet below the surface. "Walking into the space, I was amazed by what he had created," one visitor wrote. "This modern-day cave digger carved and created an incredible work of art through sandstone that was awe-inspiring." The Neymark residence continued to function as a home. Shell and Liz still lived there, surrounded by walls that Paulette had shaped during Liz's cancer treatment, in rooms that had taken 2 years instead of 2 months to complete. The cave had running water, electricity, built-in drums that resonated when you walked across them, bed platforms excavated directly into the stone. It was the only cave Paulette had designed as a permanent dwelling. It was proof that his method produced not just art, but functional architecture, spaces that could be inhabited, that could shelter human life, that could serve practical purposes while remaining works of profound aesthetic achievement. The Tree of Human Kindness remained on the market, part of a 208-acre property that had been listed at various prices between $475,000 and $995,000. The cave sat underground, invisible from the surface, its candlelit niches and intricate carvings waiting for someone wealthy enough to buy the land and curious enough to climb down into the mountain. Paulette's connection to these places was complicated. He had created them. He had given years of his life to each one. But he did not own them. He had not profited from their increasing value. The caves belonged to others, patrons who had hired him, landowners who had provided the raw material of sandstone cliffs and legal permission. This arrangement would have embittered most artists. To create work valued at nearly $1 million while earning $12 an hour, to watch others profit from your labor, to know that the caves would outlast you by centuries while you struggled to pay bills, these were conditions that invited resentment. Paulette showed none. "When you are doing something you love and are drawn to it, you want to do it all the time," he said. The statement was not philosophical posturing. It was simply the truth of his experience. He had never worked for money. He had never worked for recognition. He had worked for the process itself, the dance of digging, the meditation of breaking stone, the discovery of shapes that seemed to already exist within the mountain. The caves were byproducts, beautiful, valuable, unprecedented, but still byproducts. The real work was the work itself, the digging, the carving, the daily return to the face of the sandstone with tools in hand and a dog at his heels. This was why the Oscar nomination had not changed him. This was why the property valuations had not altered his behavior. This was why he kept working on his magnum opus, a private project with no patron, no deadline, no one to answer to, while journalists asked questions and critics wrote reviews, and the world finally noticed what he had been doing for 25 years. The attention was pleasant, perhaps. The recognition was satisfying, probably, but neither was the point. The point was the cave waiting inside the mountain. The point was the pickaxe against the stone. The point was another morning in the desert, another day of labor, another inch of progress towards something only he could see. Paulette's work connected to threads running through contemporary culture that he had never intended to engage. The return to craft, the suspicion of mechanization, the hunger for spaces that felt genuinely made rather than manufactured. These were obsessions of the early 21st century, responses to a world that seemed increasingly automated, standardized, stripped of human touch. Paulette had not thought about any of this when he started digging caves in 1987. He had simply wanted to carve sanctuaries out of stone. But the world had caught up to his sensibility, had begun to value what he had been doing all along. His caves existed in opposition to everything modern construction represented. They were slow where modern building was fast, 10 years for a single structure, not 10 months or 10 weeks. They were singular where modern building was standardized, each cave unique, shaped by the specific qualities of its sandstone, impossible to duplicate or mass-produce. They were created by one person working with hand tools where modern building deployed teams, machines, industrial materials, efficiency calculations. The caves were, in a sense, impossible. They should not exist in a world organized around profit and scale and speed. Their existence was proof that another way remained available if anyone had the patience, endurance, and indifference to conventional success required to pursue it. Paulette understood this, though he framed it differently. "I see this as an environmental project," he explained. "I'm trying to open up people's feelings." The caves were therapeutic spaces. He believed they created what he called the cave effect, a psychological transformation triggered by the juxtaposition of being underground while sunlight streamed in, the sense of enclosure combined with the presence of sky, the darkness of earth married to the brightness of day. "It has a lot to do with the juxtaposition of opposites," he said. "The sense of being underground with the light streaming in, those are the juxtapositions of the two metaphors of our life. The inside, the within, and the light of the open sky." He wanted people to experience a break in the continuity of who they were. A moment of pause in the constant chatter of modern life, a space where something could shift. "In that break," he said, "a lot of things can happen. Personal insights, access to enthusiasms. I've seen it happen. It's fun to watch. It keeps me digging." His ambitions extended beyond individual visitors. He spoke of caves as societal tools, instruments for connecting people to the earth and to their own inner sense of who they are. He imagined healing retreats, community gathering places, waterfall-fed pools inside carved chambers. Whether these visions would materialize remained uncertain. Paulette was in his 70s. His magnum opus, the 10-year project with no patron interference, continued. But time was finite in ways that sandstone was not. "This is the largest thing I've ever done," he said of the magnum opus. "I'm taking all the things that I've learned in all the other caves over the years and finally getting an opportunity to experiment with gilding the lily." His plan was to carve and to paint, to create what he hoped would be a healing retreat complete with a waterfall and pool. A culmination of everything he had learned across 3 decades of work. But the project would take years, and Paulette's body had already absorbed decades of punishment, the toll of moving stone by hand, of hiking miles into the desert with equipment on his back, of working alone in conditions that would have retired most men long ago. He continued anyway. "When I'm doing this dance of labor, I'm totally engrossed in it," he said. "I'm feeling my body. I give myself over to it. It's a type of surrender." The dance would continue until it could not. The caves would accumulate until he stopped, and then nothing. No successor, no movement, no transmission of knowledge to the next generation. Just the caves themselves. 14 sanctuaries carved into the mountains of northern New Mexico, waiting for visitors who might never come, preserving the evidence of one man's impossible persistence against the indifference of time and stone. The real estate listing is still active. 208 acres of New Mexico desert. The price has fluctuated, $995,000 at the peak, $475,000 at the low, settling somewhere in between depending on the market and the motivation of the sellers. The value derives from two structures that cannot be seen from the surface. Underground sanctuaries carved by hand over years of patient labor. The tree of human kindness with its intricate carvings and candlelit niches. A smaller chamber with smooth walls and light streaming through mountainside windows. The language has shifted. What was once hole digging is now land art. What was once obsession is now vision. What was once eccentric is now renowned cave artist Ra Paulette. The words appear in official property listings, in tour descriptions, in the critical assessments that began accumulating after the documentary premiered. The transformation is complete, on paper at least, in the world's estimation, if not in the man himself. Ra Paulette remains unchanged. In the quiet of a desert morning, a man in his 70s straps a wheelbarrow onto a sled-like device. He hoists the awkward assemblage onto his back, the same motion he has performed thousands of times over 35 years, the weight familiar against his shoulders, the balance automatic after decades of practice. He moves across the rock-strewn landscape with a dancer's grace, his dog at his heels. The same dog or a different dog, it matters less than the routine, the ritual, the return to work that has defined his life since he first noticed a teenager's crude cave in Ojo Caliente sandstone and understood what he was meant to do. At the face of the sandstone, he raises his pickaxe. The stone waits. It has waited for millions of years, formed from ancient seabeds compressed into solid rock, patient beyond human comprehension. It will wait millions more after Paulette is gone, after the caves he carved have weathered and collapsed and returned to the mountain that birthed them. But for now, the stone yields. One strike, then another. The rhythm begins, the dance of digging that Paulette has performed every working day for 3.5 decades. Breaking rock, shoveling debris, loading the wheelbarrow, hauling the material outside, returning to the face, starting again. He has been doing this for 35 years. He will continue until he cannot. Not for money. He earned $12 an hour when he earned anything at all. Properties containing his work have sold for nearly $1 million, and he saw none of it, not for recognition. The Academy Award nomination hangs on a wall somewhere, probably. The reviews sit in archives, the comparisons to Gordy and Goldsworthy preserved in digital files that Paulette has likely never read. The recognition came. It came after 25 years of silence, but it came too late to change anything, to alter the pattern of a life already fixed in its course. He digs because the caves are there, waiting inside the stone, because the process itself is the point, because some things can only be accomplished by someone too stubborn to understand they are impossible. The neighbors thought he was crazy. They watched him walk into the desert each morning with a wheelbarrow strapped to his back, year after year, earning nothing while his wife paid the bills. They shook their heads at the eccentric who dug holes for a living, who charged $12 an hour, who could not meet a deadline or keep a patron satisfied. The engineers said it would collapse. No blueprints, no surveys, no structural calculations, just a man with a pickaxe and an instinct for stone. Basic physics, they said. Building codes exist for a reason. Sandstone is unpredictable. The ceiling will come down. The patrons demanded timelines he could not meet. 2 months stretched to 2 years. Budgets exploded. Visions clashed. Projects were terminated mid-construction. Compromises forced. Arguments left unresolved. The art world ignored him for a quarter century. No galleries, no collectors, no grants, no institutional support. 25 years of daily labor, and the establishment responded with absolute silence. He kept digging. The caves accumulated. The method proved itself. The skeptics were forced to reckon with results they had not predicted, or fell silent, which amounted to the same thing. Properties he had transformed sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Critics compared him to the canonical figures of land art. The Academy nominated his story for an Oscar. Visitors paid $50 each to walk through spaces he had carved by hand, to sit on benches he had sculpted from solid rock, to look up at skylights he had punched through 30 feet of stone. The neighbors stopped laughing a long time ago. But Ra Paulette is not thinking about the neighbors this morning. He is not thinking about the Oscar nomination, or the property valuations, or the reviews that placed him alongside Gordy and Goldsworthy. He is not thinking about the patrons who complained, or the wife who called him Peter Pan, or the art world that ignored him until it couldn't anymore. He is thinking about the stone, about the shape emerging from the darkness, about the floor that needs to be found, about the skylight that will eventually draw sunlight into a chamber that has never seen natural light before, about the magnum opus, 10 years of work, maybe more, with no patron and no deadline and no one to answer to except himself and the mountain. The pickaxe falls, the stone yields, the wheelbarrow fills. Ra Paulette is still digging.